Chapter 1: Teaching Climates and Publicness. For many years, advocates have argued that charter schools provide different learning opportunities for students, at least in part by changing the status and work of teachers. Ember Reichgott-Junge, the Minnesota State Legislature, who wrote the first state charter law, noted, "For me, chartering was all about empowering teachers, giving them the authority to take leadership as professionals by spearheading and forming these charter schools." Similarly, Joe Nathan, an early supporter of charter schools, placed teachers at the heart of the case for charter schools. This country's public schools employ many talented, committed educators. Unfortunately, these excellent teachers are often frustrated by a system that does not value their skills. They are disappointed by an administrative bureaucracy that sometimes stifles their creativity, and by parents who object to proposed reforms and do not want their children to participate. They discovered that it is difficult to remove mediocre teachers from public schools. As the frustrations mount, energetic, enthusiastic teachers become bitter, burnt-out teachers. The charter movement gives real power not only to parents and children to choose the kind of school that makes sense for them, but also to teachers to use their skills, talents, and energy. Along with this opportunity comes responsibility. The responsibility to demonstrate improved student achievement as measured by standardized tests and other assessments. By changing the environment in which teachers work, he argued, there would be reward for progress with students and consequences if there is no progress. Early theorists' focus on teachers makes sense. Teachers aren't all-powerful, but they occupy a central position in popular and academic theories of how schools function and students learn. But their prominence isn't just theoretical. Empirical research shows a relatively strong connection between a school's teaching climate, the nature of its teaching environment, and the outcomes that students achieve. If teaching climates matter, and charter schools aim to foster teaching climates differently than those found in public schools, did the experiment turn out as expected? In essence, these are the three competing views. From one perspective, charter schools have fulfilled their potential. They are relatively free of red tape and full of innovation. Because they have few of the bureaucratic encumbrances that come with traditional public schools, hereafter public schools, teachers in charter schools can use their expertise and discretion to teach students in nuanced, tailored ways. But this view does not envision teachers as having unrestrained freedom. Along with the schools they teach in, teachers are accountable for students' learning. That is, charter teachers, like their schools, have greater autonomy in exchange for greater accountability. In this way, they have become what Albert Shanker, an early supporter, hoped. He believed that charter schools would give teachers the latitude to abandon things that don't work and create a structure that more closely reflects what we know about how students engage and learn. He added a caveat, however. This in no way means going back to the 1960s and giving each teacher and student a license to do their own thing without supervision or accountability. A contrasting view depicts life inside charter schools as unregulated, mismanaged, and obsessed with high-stakes testing. From this perspective, the charter experiment went quickly off the rails as corporations and educational management organizations, EMOs, seized control of public dollars and schools. Because charter schools have lower levels of unionization, they create difficult working conditions for teachers, less pay, more work, sacrifice teacher discretion for the dictates of a corporate board, and prevent teachers from using their collective voice. These test-focused schools lose the forest for the trees and put unremitting pressure on teachers to meet student performance goals. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised when we see a video of an elementary school teacher in a Brooklyn charter school screaming unreasonably at a little girl for getting an answer wrong on a math quiz. A third view emphasizes the diversity of charter schools and suggests few commonalities in teaching and learning across the charter landscape. One early tour of the sector noted the enormous difference found among charter schools in almost every conceivable way, site, curriculum, philosophy, and age of students, to name a few points of divergence. Another observer noted that charter schools were so diverse that it would be misleading to generalize about them, as if they were one entity. A more recent review makes a similar point. It is impossible to make a generalization that applies equally to all charters, because charters vary from state to state, and charters vary even within the same district. As a result, some have argued the charter idea is a pedagogic empty vessel. If these accounts are right, and recognizing that a school is a charter conveys little information about how it operates or what students experience, it becomes harder to justify the scholarly attention and resources, public and philanthropic, devoted to this experiment. In other words, if the charter label isn't associated with actual differences in teaching and learning, it's like arguing about differences between West Coast and East Coast schools. It's a distinction with little meaningful difference. If teaching is central to the theory of how charter schools work, and an enormous amount of time and resources has been spent comparing public and charter schools, how can these three perspectives coexist? One reason for the confusion is that most students of public and charter schools have focused on outcomes, like student test scores or graduation rates. These studies are helpful, but because test scores are influenced by more than just in-school influences, the scores may reveal little about how the intermediate aspects of the theory, what teachers and students are doing, and how schools are functioning. And to address this omission in this book, I take a different approach. Putting teachers at the center of the analysis, I ask, do charter schools cultivate different teaching climates from those found in charter schools? To answer this question, I've answered hundreds of thousands of teacher surveys from across the nation over a 15-year period. Clearly, this approach isn't perfect. For one thing, teachers aren't the only perspective needed to understand teaching and learning inside charter and public schools. Also, how schools function inside their walls says nothing about their effects on the broader system of public education, including questions about segregation, diverted funding, etc. Nonetheless, examining teaching climates is crucial because they are central to arguments for and against charter schools. By comparing this aspect of life in public and charter schools rigorously and over time, the book provides clarity about why we might or might not experience different student outcomes in the first place. To begin the inquiry, let's scrutinize the rationale between the cases for charter schools. Advocates suggest that charter schools function better than public schools because charters are less public. Why, at the level of theory, might we expect that publicness matters for how schools operate? Publicness, organizational theory, and charter schools. Like the broader privatization movement, arguments for charter schools are rooted in expectations about the nature and performance of public organizations. Specifically, critics allege that public schools, like most other public organizations, have short-sighted leadership and layer upon layer of red tape. However, differences between public and private organizations that seem obvious at first glance are often harder to discern on closer extension. For this reason, it is important to define publicness and locate public and charter schools accordingly. For many years, scholars have described the blurred lines between state and market and public and private. As a result, publicness is best understood as a continuum. Organizations that are predominantly owned, funded, and controlled by public or political authorities are classified as more public. Those predominantly owned, funded, and controlled by private authorities or economic forces are closer to the private end of the continuum. Organizations with a mix of public and private ownership, funding, and control are somewhat between those poles. Using this framework, both charter schools and public schools have high levels of publicness. In terms of funding, both types of schools rely predominantly on public revenues. In fact, though both receive non-public funds, charter schools may, on average, depend more on public money than do public schools. Similarly, there are few differences in ownership. Both are authorized by public entities like states, school districts, or charter granting agencies. The key difference then is how the schools are controlled. Charter schools are privately operated and tend to have more leeway from state and district rules and regulations than do public schools. In other words, although charter schools are theoretically accountable to the public via charter granting agencies or to parents who choose to apply or not apply to the schools, voting with their feet, it is more difficult for the public to influence how charter schools are managed on a day-to-day basis. As a result, many decisions about how charter schools are run, from curricula to grades offered to decisions about personnel, are made by privately selected school leaders or boards of directors. If so, charter schools are not analogous to private or parochial schools, which are funded, owned, and operated privately. Rather, they are best understood as public-private hybrids or quasi-public entities. However, if we choose to label them, charter schools are less public than public schools, which are directly controlled and regulated by district and state entities. If this characterization is right, why might the teaching climate of public and charter schools differ? To answer this question, we must understand how teaching climates are formed and what effect, if any, publicness might have on them. Teaching climates as a part of a school's general climate are likely to be shaped by how schools are formally and informally organized, and the character of the people who join them, decisions made by school leaders. In other words, if you want to understand the influences on a school's teaching climate, you need to understand a broad array of structural factors, like where the school is located and how it is funded, as well as narrower influences like who works there. For publicness to matter inside schools, it would need to affect those drivers of teaching climate. In fact, the public administration literature suggests that variation in publicness may affect how schools are organized, staffed, and operated. At the most general level, public organizations are thought to be more constrained by political authority. They must answer to elected officials from varied political institutions and pay close attention to public opinion. Though this constraint may be desirable from the standpoint of popular sovereignty, many have argued that this makes public organizations less responsive to change, more focused on processes and outcomes, and less efficient. Because private or quasi-public organizations are less constrained by political authority and more constrained by economic authority, like making a profit or meeting a budget, they may be more nimble and efficient. If these accounts are right, an organization's publicness may in fact affect how it operates. Specifically, public organizations would function differently from private organizations because differences in management, rule environment, and employee self-selection. Let's explore each of these in turn. Most management theories are premised on a simple expectation. The choices that the leaders make as they interact with the environment, the employees, can affect how these organizations operate. In this way, managers matter. Though all managers can influence how their employees and organizations perform, public managers are often considered less powerful. They are more likely than managers in private or quasi-public organizations to be given ambiguous objectives and to have to respond to multiple political leaders, like a mayor or a school board. Additionally, public managers must reckon with civil service rules and high levels of union membership. both of which narrow the scope of their managerial options. As a result, these managers theoretically have more difficult times exercising leadership, punishing and rewarding employees, and, in the aggregate, managing their organizations. If these general expectations apply to schools, teachers in charter schools might experience more dynamic, results-driven school leaders than those in public schools. Second, publicness might matter because of its association with different environments. If public organizations are often saddled with vague or conflicting goals, they may be more focused on processes and process accountability than their private organizations, which are more focused on outcomes. In public organizations, this could lead to a thickened regulatory environment and red tape, rules, regulations, and procedures that remain in force and entail a compliance burden, but do not advance the legitimate purposes that the rules were intended to serve. In fact, two veteran organizational theorists observe one of the most enduring findings in red tape research is one that conforms nicely to common sense expectations. Government agencies tend to have higher levels of red tape. Because they are less public, charter schools might foster teaching climates that are less bureaucratic and more encouraging of innovation than public school teaching climates. The third pathway in which publicness might affect the school's teaching climate and self-selection. Many organizational theories suggest that there are established patterns of selection between individuals and organizations. For example, attraction, selection, attrition, and person-organization fit theories argue that organizations are shaped by the attributes of the people who are attracted to and choose to remain in them. Because of the long-standing socioeconomic connections and patterns, people who think or act in a particular way may self-select into specific organizations. An organization's character and continuity may therefore depend more on employee self-selection than on organizational imprinting. If so, perhaps organization with different levels of publicness attracts employees with different mindsets. For example, we might imagine that teachers choosing charter schools, which tend to have lower salaries but may offer teachers greater autonomy, bring a different approach and set of expectations to their work than do teachers choosing public schools. In this way, self-selection could explain why charter and public schools would foster different teaching climates. As this discussion shows, there are theoretical reasons to expect that charter and public schools would foster different teaching climates. Because they are less public, charter schools might be managed differently and have different rule environments and attract different types of teachers. Nonetheless, there is considerable disagreement about this expectation. As described in Chapter 2, some theorists argue that too much has been made of a school's publicness. Instead, they argue a variety of other factors shape how schools function. This book takes these concerns seriously. In fact, its main point is to scrutinize the disagreement empirically by determining whether charter and public schools actually have different teaching climates inside the chapter sector. As noted at the beginning of this chapter, some observers have asked whether charter schools are alike enough to be grouped categorically. This book will speak to this question by evaluating whether there are discernible differences between the teaching climates of public and charter schools. Whether there are differences or not, each chapter of the book also devotes some space to secondary inquiry, looking inside the charter sector itself. Specifically, the book asks, what explains differences in the teaching climates of charter schools? It answers the question by focusing on two high-profile characteristics of these schools, whether teachers worked in schools run by EMOs or whether they worked in nonprofit or for-profit schools. These factors direct our attention to organizational characteristics and motives that, on the face, would seem to have the potential to explain why some charter schools have different teaching climates than others. In addition, chapters 4, 5, and 8 look into the amount of operational flexibility granted to schools by their state's charter law, as gauged by a charter school advocacy group, the Center for Educational Reform, or CER. Chapter 2 considers the theories driving these expectations in some depth. It asks why a school's status as a part of a franchise run by an EMO versus operating independently, or profit status, or profit versus not-profit, might affect its teaching climate. It also investigates how a state's charter law, be it operationally permissive or restrictive, might affect the teaching climate in charters. By subjecting these explanations to empirical scrutiny, the book helps explain variation in teaching climates within the charter sector. Research design. Methodologically, there are a variety of options for studying teachers and teaching climates, including ethnographies, interviews, and surveys. Each approach has its costs and benefits. This book, which seeks to determine whether there were differences in the teaching climates of charter and public schools over time and across a wide geographic space, relies chiefly on surveys. Using a wide lens, it is helpful because the public debate over charter schools tends to be dominated by anecdotes pointing to one or two high-flying or troubled schools. The academic literature has more nuance, but a recent review found over 500 academic publications concluded there is a paucity of national studies of charter schools. Rather, most studies tend to focus on a handful of schools or locations. For example, in their sector looking at teacher collaboration, they note the research to date is spotty, with little conclusive evidence of widespread practices that promote increased opportunities for teacher collaboration. One limitation of the research in this area is that it tends to report isolated case studies that are by no means generalizable to the broader charter populations. By examining hundreds of thousands of teacher surveys from 3 sources, one of which covers a 15-year period, I hope to develop a broader perspective on differences in the teaching climates of charters and public schools. Data. The most geographically broad data that I analyze in this book are teachers' responses to the Schools and Staffing Survey, SASS, a national survey concluded by the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, NCES. Since the 1999 to 2000 survey, the NCES has included charter schools and teachers along with its traditional focus on private schools and teachers. Because many of the questions asked on the SASS are repeated each year, the book can present a dynamic picture of how charters and public schools evolved over time. Specifically, it will compare teachers in charters and public schools in the 1999 to 2000, 2003 to 2004, 2007 to 2008, and 2011 to 2012 school years. Because the SASS has a national representative sampling frame, the results of this analysis can be generalized across the United States. Across these years, the survey included an average of 35,000 teachers in 7,500 schools. Of this total, an average of 1,500 teachers worked in 400 charter schools. A geographically narrower source of data comes from a 6 statewide Teaching, Empowerment, Leading, and Learning TEL surveys conducted by the New Teacher Center, NTC. The NTC, a nonprofit organization devoted to improving student learning by studying school teaching and learning conditions, fielded surveys in Delaware, Colorado, Tennessee, and Maryland during the 2012 to 2013 school year, and in North Carolina and Massachusetts during the 2013 to 2014 school year. In contrast with the SASS, which use a nationally representative sample, the TELL surveys examine entire populations with some exceptions. All teachers in public and charter schools within each state had an opportunity to take the surveys. Although the survey questionnaires used in each state were not identical, many of the questions were asked in all 6 settings. Consequently, the TEL data enable an in-depth comparison of many schools and teachers across 6 states. In total, the pooled dataset includes approximately 235,000 teachers in 8,500 schools. Of this total, about 5,000 teachers worked in 338 charter schools. I collected the final data, the Delaware Teacher Survey DTS, during the 2014 to 2015 school year. Like the TEL surveys, the DTS gave all teachers in charter and public schools the chance to take the survey. In total, the DTS datasets included about 1,000 teachers in 180 schools. Of that total, 130 teachers taught in 20 charter schools. These data are obviously the narrowest geographically, but because I designed the questionnaire, I could ask previously unasked questions to understand the differences between the teaching climates of charter and public schools. For example, the DTS included standard questions from leadership research to learn whether teachers in public and charter schools had different experiences with transformational and transactional leadership. In this way, these data permitted an exploration of parts of teaching climate that the other datasets could not. Supplementing this data survey, I conducted a handful of in-depth interviews with a subset of survey respondents. These interviews enabled me to provide some qualitative evidence to supplement the book's statistical analysis. Of the 3 datasets, the SAS data had several advantages. The data were 1. Nationally representative, 2. Enabled a dynamic view of the charter sector, 3. Could be used to study turnover when paired with the NCES teacher follow-up survey, and 4. Included the most wide-ranging control variables of the 3 datasets. For these reasons, the book gives the most weight to the findings from the SASS analysis. TEL and DTS data serve as useful complements by exploring aspects of the teaching climates of charter and public schools not covered by the SAS. Although the pooled TEL data include a geographically diverse array of states, and although Delaware was selected for the DTS partly because of its fairly middle-of-the-road charter law, as valued by CER, neither of these surveys was representative of all states. According to findings from the TEL survey, the DTS, unlike those from SAS, cannot be generalized to the rest of the nation. Self-selection. Previous efforts to gauge differences between charter and public schools have raised serious concerns about self-selection. Because students are not randomly assigned to schools, it is not clear whether any difference in student achievement or learning are driven by in-school influences like teaching, programming, or school leaderships, or out-of-school influences like student and family characteristics. Although this book moves away from test scores and focuses on teaching climates, self-selection may play some role in the findings reported here. Teachers, like students, are not randomly assigned to schools, but rather pick and choose schools according to a mixture of financial, professional, and personal factors. As noted above, this choice may have a significant impact on a school's teaching climate. Wayne Hoy notes that a school's climate is influenced by the formal organization, informal organization, personalities of participants, and the leadership of the school, emphasis added. However, while student self-selection does obvious harm to inferences about the effects of charter schools on student learning, the effect of teacher self-selection on inferences about teaching climates is not as concerning. To understand why, assume for the moment that teachers who favor greater classroom flexibility self-select into charter schools, and in the surveys analyzed here, report greater autonomy. Readers might question the legitimacy of this finding, arguing that these teachers were biased towards that view at the outset, or had bought into the school's rhetoric about flexibility. In response, I would make 2 points. First, teachers who choose a school for flexibility might be harder judges about whether they actually have autonomy than teachers who do not. In other words, the view that self-selection biases teachers' responses ignores the possibility that their experiences could have the opposite effect. Perhaps autonomy-seeking teachers make it harder to show that charter schools cultivate more autonomous classroom environments because such teachers come with high expectations. Second, and related to this point, the findings that charter teachers believe that their work in flexible workplaces would not undermine the influence of charter schools foster greater teacher autonomy unless these teachers were falsely reporting that they had autonomy. Although false reporting may happen, it is not unique to teachers in charter schools. In other words, survey researchers rarely know how much respondents actually do or believe what they say. But teachers in charter schools are probably no more likely to dissemble than teachers in public schools. In the absence of false reporting, self-selection would not affect the inferences drawn about teaching climates because, from the perspective of student experiences and learning, it matters little why teachers in charter schools report doing things differently than teachers in public schools. The key question is whether these differences actually exist. However, student self-selection may harm efforts to discern differences between charter and public schools in a key way. Students and parents play some role in shaping teaching climates. To put it simply, the experiences teachers report are likely to be tied at least partly to the students you select into their schools. This connection is important to keep in mind, but there are 2 reasons student self-selection does not totally defeat what this book is trying to accomplish. First, to deal with any effect that student self-selection may have on teaching climates, this book's empirical analysis includes a variety of school-level variables that measure student characteristics like race, ability, and poverty. In doing so, the analysis controls for some of the observable differences created by self-selection and enables greater confidence that any observed differences in teaching climate are due to school type versus charter versus public. Second, although students may play some role in shaping what teachers experiences and do, in-school influences like how a school is organized are led through to play the major role. For example, Robert Kelly and colleagues argue that school administrators have the biggest effect on a school's learning environment. Even though students affect a school's teaching climate, it is unlikely that they play the dominant or decisive role. For example, whether teachers believe that they are effective leaders in their schools, a topic explored in Chapter 5, seems likely to be driven more by influences from administrators or school policies than by the characteristics of students. As this example suggests, concerns about self-selection are less worrisome in some areas than this book investigates than others. Chapters gauging teachers' experiences with autonomy and accountability, Chapter 4, Teacher Leadership and Coordination, Chapter 5, Working Conditions, Chapter 6, and Experiences with Administrators, Chapter 8, would seem less influenced by student self-selection. However, the book's focus on parent and community engagement, Chapter 7, and Student Characteristics, Chapter 3, are likely to be more influenced by student self-selection. Limitations and caveats. In addition to the challenges of self-selection, this book has a few other limitations and caveats. First, teaching climates affect student learning but aren't all powerful. Research shows that student achievement is most strongly associated with an array of factors over which schools and teachers have little control, like student socioeconomic status. Thus, the book argues that teachers and the environments that they work in are important foci of study. and at the same time it acknowledges that student leadership is shaped by much more than school's teaching climate. Second, teachers are vital stakeholders in schools and, as operative employees, offer a crucial perspective on what is happening inside them. But there are a variety of other critical perspectives on how schools operate, including those experienced by parents, students, and administrators. The school climate literature recognizes the best way to understand how a school functions is to study the perspectives and experiences of a diverse array of stakeholders. This book's portrait of teaching climates is limited in that it only provides the perspective of teachers. Third, teaching climates, like any part of an organization's climate, consists of multiple characteristics. This book focuses on 6 aspects of a school's teaching climate which are prominent in the educational literature and the charter school debate outlined below. And the areas covered here are expansive but incomplete. Just as there are many views about what matters in a school's climate, several important aspects of teaching are not included here. For instance, I will not address differences or similarities in the content of what is taught, instructional quality, or the socio-emotional connections fostered between teachers and students. In other words, this book doesn't claim to study all aspects of a school's teaching climate. Hopefully, future work can fill the gaps here. Finally, and perhaps most important, the debate over charter schools raises organizational and systemic questions. But this book focuses only on organizational issues. Since organizational claims are central to arguments for and against charter school, this is an essential approach. Nonetheless, research like this can't speak to system-wide effects like segregation or defunding. Readers will therefore need to take the findings presented here and determine how the organizational characteristics of charter and public schools fit with research on what effects, if any, charter schools are having on the broader public school system. Each of the aforementioned limitations and caveats is real and should not be minimized. At the same time, all effort to compare charter and public schools have important limitations, so they aren't fatal for what this book tries to do. By providing a novel perspective on what the rhetoric on both sides of the charter school debate matches the reality of life inside these schools, this book offers a crucial perspective for scholars, advocates, and policymakers. Chapter Overview: Comparing the teaching climates of charter and public schools. This book is motivated by a desire to understand whether charter and public schools function differently. The question draws from and reflects a general logic evident in public discourse about privatization as well as academic fields like organizational studies, public administration, and public policy, that an organization's level of publicness has significant effects on how it functions. The book uses teachers' experiences, attitudes, and behavior as indicators of their school's teaching climates. My goal is to assess the extent to which public and charter schools actually have different teaching climates. To begin the inquiry, Chapter 2 revisits the theoretical question at the heart of this book. Why might the publicness of a school affect its teaching climate? Many argue that publicness drives or is associated with factors that shape how schools and teachers function. If so, we would expect that charter schools, by being less public, might foster teaching climates that differ considerably from those found in public schools. However, some organizational theorists argue that too much has been made of publicness. Countering the proponents of privatization, the conventional wisdom about government bureaucracy, these theorists implied that publicness would not likely shape how schools and teachers function. If so, perhaps we would not expect to see differences in the teaching climates of charter and public schools. Chapter 2 also discusses the theories behind the book's secondary goal, explaining the variation in teaching climates within the second sector. The book then moves to its empirical analyses. Chapter 3 examines the school, student, and teacher characteristics of charter and public schools from the 1909 to 2000 through the 2011 to 2012 school years. Specifically, it compares these schools in terms of their locations, urban and rural enrollments, and student bodies. It also examines the characteristics of teachers in these different schools. By detailing where these schools were located and the characteristics of the people inside them, this chapter starts to compare the teaching climates of charter and public schools. In addition, by showing how charter and public schools systematically differ, the chapter identifies important control variables for the remaining analysis. Chapter 4 examines what is often portrayed as the essential promise, trade-off, or bargain of charter schools. Enhanced freedom for enhanced accountability. Put simply, charter school advocates argue that in exchange for a greater room to experiment and innovate, charter schools are held more accountable than public schools. Many observers have raised questions about this trade-off and wondered whether autonomy and accountability are, to some extent at least, mutually exclusive. In this light, Chapter 4 explores whether charter schools foster climates which teachers have more autonomy and are held more accountability than teachers in public schools. It also looks at two of the corollaries of autonomy, innovation and red tape. One of these main expectations about charter schools is that they reduce red tape and give teachers autonomy so they can be more innovative. Chapter 4 examines these expectations empirically. The chapter concludes by looking into the charter sector itself to ask how differences in franchising, tax status, and state charter laws might explain differences in autonomy and accountability. Chapter 5 examines teacher leadership and collaboration. One of the initial and enduring rationales for charter schools is they would give teachers a chance to work closer with their colleagues and to offer greater input into how their schools operate. These claims are related to but distinct from autonomy, where autonomy refers to teachers' ability to make decisions about how they teach. Their leadership refers to the role that teachers play in funding their schools. Teacher collaboration, the extent to which teachers work together, is important to study because charter schools are purposely decentralized. Charter proponents expect that decentralization removes barriers to teacher collaboration, but as others have noted, decentralization may have the opposite effect, creating disorder and reducing cooperation. This chapter uses teacher survey responses to look for evidence of differences between teacher leadership and collaboration in charter and public schools. It also asks how teacher leadership and collaboration vary within the charter sector. Another crucial aspect of the teaching climate, teacher working conditions and turnover, is the topic of Chapter 6. Both supporters and critics of charter schools suggest that teachers in these schools work more hours and under more difficult conditions. For supporters, this supposition shows dedication. For critics, it suggests that teachers in charter schools are overworked, largely because they are not unionized, and that the model is not sustainable. Perhaps as a result, there has been considerable interest in differences between charter and public schools in teacher satisfaction and turnover. To examine the working conditions inside charter and public schools, this chapter examines various aspects of teachers' experiences, including the numbers of hours worked, pay, satisfaction, and turnover. The chapter concludes by asking about teachers' working conditions and turnover within the charter sector. Chapter 7 shifts the focus to the relationship between schools, communities, and parents, a central part of how schools function. Charter proponents suggest that these schools foster high levels of parental and community engagements in the public schools. Whether this observation was true in the early days of the charter sector or more recently remains to be seen. The chapter examines these expectations empirically to determine if teachers in charter schools indicate that they work in schools with high levels of community and parent engagement than do teachers in public schools. It also investigates the differences in community and parent engagement within the charter sector. The final empirical chapter, Chapter 8, examines teachers' experiences with administrators. It asks if teachers in charter schools are more likely to argue that their schools are guided by supportive, driven school leaders than teachers in public schools. Do school leaders in charter schools use performance management techniques, the collection and use of information to enhance a school's performance, more than school leaders in public schools? What explains the variation in teachers' experiences with leadership inside the charter sector? Chapter 9, the conclusion, argues that the teaching climates of charter schools are different from those imagined by both proponents and critics. In some respects, charter schools appear to be meeting their promise. In other respects, they aren't. In short, the differences between the teaching climates of public and charter schools are complicated and belly simple-sounding bites or stereotypes. The chapter closes by considering what these findings imply for the debate over charter schools and organizational theory.